Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University School of Gender and Development Studies, SOGDS. Postgraduate Diploma in Women's and Gender Studies, PGDWGSR. MWG102 Gender and Power. Block to Gender and Other Structural Inequalities. Unit-8 Race and Ethnicity. 8.1 Introduction. In the last 2 units we read about the impact of class and caste on gender. In this unit, we shall dwell upon another important social system that greatly affects gender, and that is race or ethnicity of an individual. In MWG101, you have already read about issues related to Black women and Dalit women. You may also find it useful to refer to the unit on post-colonial feminism of the same course. In this unit we will look more closely into the concept of racism, its historical background, both in the West and in context of India. The unit will also highlight the movement of Black feminism in the US. Further, you will learn about issues relating to women and colonization from the Third World feminist perspective, and specially focus on issues relating to tribal women in India. 8.2 Learning Outcomes. After studying this unit, you should be able to define the concept of racism, explain the features of Black feminism, analyze the nature of feminism in Third World countries, and examine the role played by gender and ethnicity in the Indian context. 8.3 Locating gender in context of race. Ethnicity. The most enduring and powerful logic of patriarchy is based on the invocation of natural or biological differences between the sexes. Until recently, such differences were considered innate and immutable, social inequalities following as an inevitable consequence of an unalterable natural order. In this sense, the category race is similar to sexual difference, since it is also grounded in biology, in the visible differences of physical appearances, most commonly associated with color. Racial differences, also presumed to be determined by birth, ordained and fixed by nature and hierarchical. Some races are considered inherently superior physically and, therefore, intellectually and culturally. The superior races assert their right, or obligation, to dominate others. Ideas of racial superiority have been deployed in different historical contexts, most powerfully by Europeans to elevate whiteness as an instrument of colonization from the 15th century onwards. In the 19th century, with the anti-slavery movements in Europe and the United States gaining momentum, the dominant race theories came under concerted attack. In the United States, the chief ideological challenge came from within through the civil rights movements. In many of the settler colonies, confrontations between colonists and indigenous peoples became cast in racial terms. In many other parts of the world, anti-colonial nationalist discourses were in uneasy tension with the imperial discourses of race. From the beginning, questions of gender were inextricably entangled with race. Gender and racial classifications have been so interdeveloped that when gender constructions are resisted, they necessarily disturb, challenge constructions of race. Thus, feminism is always in conversation with the politics of race. In the Indian context, there has been some debate on the relationship between race and caste. At the United Nations Conference on Racism at Durban in 2001, there was an attempt to renew the argument that the Indian caste system was a form of racism. There are 2 reasons for such an equation. First, the basis of caste is considered to be Varna, which literally means color and is supposed to be grounded in the primary distinction between fair, invading, Aryans and dark, indigenous, Dravidians. Many scholars believe that these theories were floated during the colonial period by British Indologists to bolster their own assertion of racial superiority. A section of the Indian elite appropriated the Aryan myth to claim proximity to the white colonizers, labeling the darker people of the southern provinces of India as Dravidians. None of this has been historically proven, however, and the theory of the racial origin of caste is pegged on highly disputable readings of Vedic texts. Fair, some say, could mean light as in learned, and varna, some say, could mean order rather than color. The second reason for equating caste with race is the existence of similarities between racial segregation apartheid in United States and in parts of Africa, and untouchability in caste Hindu society. While there are, undoubtedly, similarities in the experiences of the oppressed in both systems, there is a crucial analytical difference between caste and race. Race stratification is arranged along a continuum of color with the whites and the blacks occupying two ends of the spectrum. The colors in between are positioned along a scale, and this is the result of interracial unions often called miscegenation. The mixing of genes. The caste system, by contrast, is premised on closed and bounded endogamous groups, with the children of intermarriage being pushed either lower in the hierarchy or outside the system altogether. Moreover, the position of the outcast or the untouchable as polluting is distinctive to the caste system. The blacks are despised. But rather than their touch being avoided, black people have been used, in many different contexts, as personal servants by white elites. As you have read in the previous unit, an understanding of the caste system along a single grid of purity pollution is misleading. The castes are discrete and cannot be ordered in a single hierarchy. The category race is considered to have greater affinity with ethnicity than with caste, and, therefore, a discussion of some of the issues of gender among indigenous peoples, or Adivasis in the Indian context, is included in this unit. 8.4 A brief history of racism. Racism is the belief in the superiority of a particular race over others following from an understanding that members of each racial group possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race. If, based on such beliefs, certain racial groups are denied rights or receive benefits, racism is said to be institutional or structural or systemic. Such racial discrimination is often upheld by governments, corporations, religions, or educational institutions or employers. The term state racism applies when governments underwrite racial discrimination by law. IGNOU. 8.1. The idea of race is grounded in the taxonomy of human population groups based on physical characteristics, which are hierarchically ordered. However, the line between physical and social cultural being always blurred, ethnic or cultural groupings often coincide or overlap with typically racial classifications. As a result, racial and ethnic discrimination is difficult to distinguish, and the United Nations conventions reflect the fluidity between these two. An extended definition of race thus includes physical attributes like color, but also nationality, including citizenship, or ethnicity or culture. It has been argued that the term race was previously used loosely to denote groups of people, and that, in such a sense, racial antagonism goes back to the beginning of history. In antiquity and in medieval times, distinguishing physical attributes of groups of people became associated with conquerors and subject populations, especially in conjunction with the expansion of slavery. Such examples range from the ancient Greeks, the Indo-Aryans, to Arab forays into Africa. The origin of the ideology of white supremacy is traced to the Reconquista in the 15th century, when the Catholic Spaniards fought a fierce and violent battle to recover the Iberian Peninsula from 6 centuries of Arab occupation. To assert purity of birth, not contaminated by the dark-skinned. More, they formulated the doctrine of the cleanliness of blood, which became the basis of the Western concept of aristocratic blue blood, a euphemism for white purity. Lacy, 1983. The doctrine of purity of blood was carried by Spanish and Portuguese colonizers to the Americas, leading to the racial separation of the various peoples. An intricate list of nomenclature for race was evolved and became the primary determinant of social status. Galno, 1971. Spanish colonial policy is often contrasted to Northern Anglo-American policy, constituting two fundamentally different approaches towards the race question. The former imposed racial hierarchies that were gradational and fluid, encouraging widespread miscegenation both with Indian and African populations. The latter established a strong taboo against racial mixing, especially among whites and blacks. Box No 8.2. The overlap between race and folk was a key element in 19th century ethnic nationalisms, e.g., Italian, German, Slavic, Turkish and Arabic. The long and varied history of race antagonisms notwithstanding, the contemporary notion of racism is considered to be a modern phenomenon. According to Michel Foucault, the first formulation of racism emerged in the early modern period as the discourse of race struggle, a historical and political discourse which Foucault opposed to the philosophical and juridical discourse of sovereignty. He traces the first appearance of racism as a social discourse to the Glorious Revolution, 1688, in Great Britain. In this discourse, race was a historical rather than a biological notion used by the bourgeoisie, the people and the aristocracy in their struggle against the monarchy. From such a notion of people emerged the nation and was enormously influential in France during the Revolution and after. Foucault, 1976-77. Box No. 8.3. A combination of social Darwinism and eugenics was the cornerstone of race. In the 19th century, however, race discourse moved along another path too. Scientific racism, ending up as the state racism of Nazi Germany, to leave a powerful but negative historical legacy. The term scientific racism, also called academic racism, is given to the modern biological definition of race developed in the 19th century, which used science to justify and support racist ideology. Various disciplines emerged to legitimate race: physical anthropology, anthropometry, craniometry, phrenology, physiognomy, and others have now been discredited as sciences. These explorations were combined at that time with new theories of social progress to argue the superiority of white European civilization, the idea of competition, and the survival of the fittest. The latter, coined by Herbert Spencer, 1864, became the basis of a body of theorization named social Darwinism. By the end of the 19th century, scientific racism was bolstered by eugenics discourses of degeneration of the race and blood heredity. The first theory of eugenics was developed in 1869 by Francis Galton, 1822-1911, who undertook a statistical study of human differences on the basis of inherited characteristics, such as intelligence. Galton, 1869. The linking of heredity to behavior became academic commonplace by early 20th century. The mid-1920s marked the high point of racism's scientific respectability. Gender became implicated with this dominant discourse of race in two particular ways. First, eugenics focused on reproduction and, by extension, on women's bodies. Ideologies of racial purity advocated stringent control over women's sexuality to ensure desirable reproduction. An extreme form of such eugenics-driven social policy was evident in Nazi Germany, but policies of coercive birth control practices, such as forced sterilization of colored and black women, was not uncommon in the United States. Margaret Sanger, a feminist celebrated for pioneering legal abortion and women's reproductive freedom, was associated with eugenics-inspired arguments about reproductive selection and control. Indeed, and this is our second and significant point, in the United States in particular, the central tenet of feminism, women's economic, political, sexual and reproductive autonomy, was defined and justified through eugenic and imperialist discourses. The figuring of the woman, white or black, as central to the progress of the nation was argued through eugenics, or the regeneration of the race, which provided the ground for legitimating female bodily sovereignty. Ate, 2000. By the early 1930s, scientific pronouncements on race came under attack within the academy from the fields of anthropology, psychology, and genetics. Only after the Second World War, however, in revulsion against the eugenics-driven Holocaust in Nazi Germany, was there a systematic debunking of biological race theories. Box No. 8.4. The UNESCO Statement, The Race Question, 1950, signed by Ashley Montagu, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Gunnar Myrdal, Julian Huxley among others, was the first concerted international effort to challenge racist theories. 8.5 Black Feminism, the U.S. Context. The race question in the Americas was complicated by its brutal plantation slavery system. By the 18th century, slaves became synonymous with blacks, and some estimated 12 million Africans had been shipped to the Americas as slaves. From the early 19th century, anti-slavery campaigns began to gain ground. In the USA, middle-class white women became active participants in this movement, called the abolitionist movement. The early women leaders, inspired by the cause of social justice, learned from anti-slavery societies how to organize, publicize, and articulate a political protest. The men at the helm of the movement, however, resented women playing active roles. There was a great deal of public anger too against women seeking to upset the race-gender social order. In 1838, the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women was held at the Pennsylvania Hall, where some 3,000 white and black women attended. A mob gathered, the women were stoned and insulted, and the hall was burned down. The attempt to silence women at anti-slavery conventions in the United States and England led directly to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's and Lucretia Mott's decision to hold the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls, NY, in June 1848. One of the articles of belief proclaimed at this and subsequent conventions was that women were in some sense slaves too. The link between abolitionism and women's rights were not provided by white women alone. Some remarkable black women also took the lead. In 1831, Maria Stuart began to write essays and make speeches against slavery, promoting educational and economic self-sufficiency for blacks. After Stuart, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman became some of the leading figures of the U.S. women's movement. Women's rights activists had believed that the abolition of slavery would mean votes for blacks and for women. However, after the Civil War ended, many national leaders continued to argue against giving women the vote. The suffragists regarded this as a betrayal, and they reacted with bitter disappointment. The different priorities concerning votes for women and votes for black men led to a split within the movement. This rift and the rhetoric employed by suffragists at this time dented the solidarity between Black and white women too. Many leading suffragettes promoted women's vote as a means of preserving white domination. Black women, however, remained actively engaged on all three fronts in the women's, civil rights and socialist movements. Much before the celebrated National Association of Colored People was established, in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, came into being in Washington, D.C., by the merger of the National Federation of Afro-American Women, the Women's Era Club of Boston, and the National League of Colored Women of Washington, D.C., and some smaller organizations that had arisen from the African American Women's Club movement. The founders of the NACW included Harriet Tubman, Margaret Murray Washington, Frances E.W. Harper, and Ida Bell Wells Barnett. Its two leading members were Josephine Ruffin and Mary Church Terrell. In the next 10 years, the NACW became involved in campaigns in favor of women's suffrage and against lynching and Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation of blacks and whites in public spaces. The twin myths of the black rapist and the promiscuity of black women constituted a strong gender plank in anti-racist struggles. Black feminists also led efforts to improve education and care for both children and the elderly. By 1918, when the United States entered the First World War, membership in the NACW had grown to an extraordinary 300,000 nationwide. After the war, women achieved the vote. In the meantime, the rift between the white and the black women leaders had grown wider. Angela Davis, perhaps the best known black feminist, wrote that black women were not allowed to vote in most of the southern states, in the ranks of the movement which had so fervently fought for the enfranchisement of women. There was hardly a cry of protest to be heard. Davies. 1981, p. 148. In the 1950s, as the civil rights movement entered a new and radical phase, under the leadership of Martin Luther King, the spark was provided by a woman civil rights leader, however. On 1 December 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, age 42, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger. Her action was not the first of its kind, but it led to the first organized movement against segregation, the Montgomery bus boycott, which in turn led to a concerted attempt to dismantle segregation. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, the new women's movement too made great strides in the 1960s. It was at the cusp of the civil rights and new women's movements that black feminism sought to define itself anew. Black women encountered discrimination in both movements on grounds of race in the women's movement and on the grounds of gender in the black liberation movement. Moreover, black was equated with black men and woman was equated with white women. Black women were being invisibilized. The aim of black feminism was to juxtapose race and gender and to develop a theory which could adequately address the ways in which race, gender, and class were interconnected in their lives. The founding moment was the formation of the National Black Feminist Organization in New York in 1973. Even though women played prominent roles in many of the anti-race campaigns of the time, there was no space in these for a gender perspective. This was true of the many strands that constituted the Black Liberation Movement, BLM, Civil Rights Movement, Black Nationalism, the Black Panthers, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and others. The rhetoric of BLM was highly gendered. Freedom was equated with manhood and the freedom of blacks with the redemption of black masculinity. Moreover, the control of women and their sexuality remained an important agenda for male black leaders. Bell Hooks pointed out that the black men tended to overemphasize white male sexual exploitation of black women as a way of expressing their disapproval of interracial relationships. Hooks, 1992. Further, women's demand for equality was not accommodated within the BLM, which sought to highlight the need for solidarity among black men and women, but on the basis of natural difference and complementary roles. The problem was not with policymakers and misogynist writers alone. Black women also faced the force of patriarchal structures within family, community, and political organizations. As in many other radical movements of the time, women were expected to make the tea and feed the men, especially those engaged in the serious business of politics. Black women who participated in the feminist movement during the 1960s were equally dissatisfied. They found themselves excluded from decision-making and public speaking, while their experiences were theorized under the general umbrella of a universal patriarchy. The differences in race and class that structured diverse experiences of black and white women were largely ignored. The greatest difficulty lay in identifying and naming the racism that was constitutive of a women's movement dominated by the white middle class elite. Black women perceived the women's movement to be complicit with racism and directed by the narrow interests of white women. As you may have noted from the above, it was, thus, within an uneasy tension between gender and race that the black feminist movement was born. In the early 1970s, there were few black women willing to identify themselves as feminists. BLM argued that black women were already as liberated as was desirable. Many black women agreed. The only oppression before black women was racism, and the battle against it would be weakened if men and women did not make common cause or the women turned against their own men. The larger, the more important and urgent struggle against racism could not be compromised. Such propaganda fed long-held misconceptions about black women, including the belief that their extraordinary strength in the face of tremendous oppression denoted liberation. Much of their celebrated freedom, working outside the home, supporting the family economically as well as emotionally, and heading the household was thrust upon them. The two best-known early formulations of the black feminist movement came from Alice Walker and the Combahee River Collective Statement. Alice Walker coined the term womanism to emphasize self-determination, appreciation for all aspects of womanhood, and the links between women and other movements. Walker, 1974. 1983, the Combahee River Collective Statement, 1986, highlighted the intersectionalities of black women's struggles against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression. They perceived black feminism as the logical political movement to combat manifold and simultaneous oppressions. Books No. 8.5. Following on these general lines, black feminist writings focused on developing theory, which addressed the simultaneity of racism, sexism, heterosexism, and class discrimination. In the early years, black feminists campaigned on issues of reproductive rights, equal access to abortion, health care, child care, violence against women, rape, battering, sexual harassment, lesbian and gay rights, police brutality, trade unions, anti-imperialist struggles, anti-racism, nuclear disarmament, and environment protection. Several organizations and meetings highlighted these agenda during the late 1970s and early 1980s, such as the Black Women Organized for Action in San Francisco, 1973, the establishment of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press, 1981, and the Black Women's Self-Help Collective in Washington, D.C., 1981. The National Black Feminist Organization, NBFO, and Black Women Organized for Action, BWAO, included. Black women from varied backgrounds, well-educated, middle-class women worked together with poorly educated women on welfare to address issues that pertained to all of them. Black feminism has succeeded in putting the issue of race and ethnicity on the agenda of feminist theory, which now includes an analysis of race, class, sexuality, as well as gender. In the rhetoric of the current Black liberation movements, however, there is relatively much less sensitivity to gender issues, posing a serious challenge for Black feminist activists. In recent years, as the theoretical focus has shifted away from categories anchored in biology such as woman, the Black feminists have been faced with new questions of identity and politics. The materialist position that being Black and or female generates certain experiences, which automatically determine variants of a Black and or feminist consciousness, can no longer be sustained. It follows that Black feminism cannot be considered the exclusive province of African American women, regardless of their experiences and approach. However, the pendulum cannot swing to the other extreme. Black feminism cannot be conceived in a void without reference to the specificity of the Black woman's social location. In response, Patricia Hill Collins speaks of the outsider within, Collins, 1991, and a dialectical relationship between the Black woman's standpoint, derived from everyday experience of gender, race, discrimination, and Black feminist thought, the specialized knowledge of experts who are part of the group and express its standpoint. So far, we have looked at the relationship between race and gender through the example of Black feminism. In the next section, let us turn to an equally important issue close to home: third world feminism in the context of colonialism and nationalism. You have been introduced to post-colonial feminism in Course I. It may help you to read the discussion presented here in conjunction with that unit in order to obtain a more comprehensive grasp of the subject. 8.6 Women, Colonialism and Nationalism. Contexts for Third World Feminism. The most influential thinker to link race and colonialism was Frantz Fanon. In Black Skin, White Masks, 1952, he analyzed the impact of colonialism on its Black victims. The book had a major influence on civil rights, anti-colonial, and Black consciousness movements around the world. Fanon's last work, The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, was called by its publisher, The Handbook for the Black Revolution. It was based on Fanon's experiences in Algeria during the War of Independence. Using a Marxist framework, Fanon explored class conflict and questions of cultural hegemony in the creation and maintenance of a new country's national consciousness. The Wretched of the Earth became one of the central documents of the Black liberation movement. Fanon's writings influenced many other anti-colonial writers. Box No 8.6. In India, the interconnection of race and gender in the colonial discourse came to the forefront in the context of the woman's question. Questions of gender became central to explorations of race and colonialism, however, only after Edward Said's enormously influential Orientalism, 1979. In the last 3 decades, scholars have explored the ways in which European colonialism in Asia and Africa was premised upon inequalities of race and gender. These two categories, anchored in biological difference, provided the naturalizing ideology to justify the conquest and rule of subject populations in far-flung areas of the globe at a time when Europeans were engaged in struggles over democracy in their own countries. The feminization of the Orient, so vividly portrayed by Said, went hand in hand with a characterization of the Western ruling race as masculine. As such, the colonizers were able to assert their natural authority to rule and protect weaker sections of the colonized society, as men reign over women by natural law. The notion that the non-white were unfit to rule themselves matched the civilizing mission that was the white man's burden: to produce powerful legitimating ideologies of colonial rule. In 1817, James Mill wrote in the History of India that the condition of women in a society was an index of its place in the hierarchy of civilizations. India scored poorly in such a test, given the spectacular barbarity of practices of sati, parda, infanticide, child marriage and so on. At that time, a section of India's elite men, exposed through the English language to the liberal and Enlightenment philosophies of the West, became open not only to self-criticism but also to improve the situation of women in Indian society. This led to the celebrated social reform movement, begin with Raja Ram Mohan Roy's successful campaign to legally abolish sati, 1829, moving to the legalization of widow remarriage spearheaded by Iswar Chandra Bandyopadhyaya Vidyasagar, 1856, and finally to the abortive attempt to raise the age of consent in marriage, 1891. It has been argued that social reform was also a nascent attempt at resisting and challenging the political and cultural disability imposed by the colonial civilizing mission. This initial response, however, gave way to a more aggressive assertion of superiority by the colonized, a project variously named as extremism, militant nationalism, or, most appropriately in recent years, as cultural nationalism. Sarkar, 2001. Three elements in cultural nationalism require emphasis here. First, there was an attempt to rewrite the history of India to prove that in ancient Hindu India, women had high social status. Maitreyi, Leelavati and Gargi became household names as examples of educated women in a remote golden past. It was argued that Muslims, coming from outside India, caused the degradation of women by introducing parda and excluding women from public life. Second, politically disenfranchised elite men sought an area of sovereignty and found it in the domestic domain. They sought the control of social institutions like family, caste and religion, a claim that the British were willing to accede in part. In an influential essay, Partha Chatterjee has argued that Indian men invested this new patriarchy with the spiritual essence of Indianness, thereby constructing the home, and women in it, as the site of resistance to colonialism. Chatterjee, 1989. The home thus was the cradle of the nation in more ways than one. As a result of such a discursive reformulation, from the late 19th century onwards, nationalists resisted any attempt by the British to intervene in gender relations in Indian society, unless it accorded with their view of an ancient, timeless and unchanging tradition. Women were thus caught between competing masculinities. They sought to improve their condition. They became complicit with a colonial power that was seeking to emasculate Indian men. As nationalists, they were expected to submit willingly to the tyrannical dictates of Indian patriarchy. The third aspect of cultural nationalism that has been the subject of much debate in Indian historiography is its contribution to the rise and growth of communalism. It has been argued that by valorizing ancient Hindu India and by designating the Muslims as foreign and as the cause of India's fall from a pinnacle of civilizational height, nationalism was itself imbued with a Hindu culture, alienating Muslims. The use of the image of the mother goddess to iconize the nation as Mother India, the songs, festivals, and inspirational literature that elaborated nationalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were suffused with Hindu imagery. Some scholars have argued that the manipulation of Hindu religious idiom did not amount to a communal intent in nationalist rhetoric, since the aim was to mobilize popular religious sentiment against colonial rule rather than against an oppositional religious community. However, the focus on home women in early nationalism had the long-term effect of rendering the condition of women hostage to communal competition and conflict. Women as the primary bearers of Hindu and, later, Islamic identities, found it more difficult to escape the patriarchal prescriptions of their respective communities. Sarkar and Brutalia, 1995. Box No 8.7. Despite these dilemmas, middle-class Indian women made great strides in education, employment and political participation in this period and achieved a significant voice including franchise and constitutional equality in independent India. The Indian case is illustrative of constructions of gender within nationalisms across a wide spectrum of the colonized world. The postulation of an authentic national essence was in many cases scripted on familial relations to justify the nation as natural, just like the biological family. This resulted in naturalizing the social hierarchy that subordinated women and children. Indeed, women have been the battleground between colonialists, who see them as an index of backwardness, and nationalists, who construct them as the embodiment of an authentic national identity. Moreover, women's bodies have often acquired symbolic significance as the nation and set its boundary. Thus, women have to be protected against attack from outside. And this means maintaining a vigilant control over them. When women took part in nationalist struggles, as they did in India, they were required to return to the home when the fire was put out or the enemy defeated. Also, as in the Indian case, while women gained significant concessions in return for their contribution to the national cause, they were often left with a sense of betrayal. Post-colonial states, dominated by male elites, have poor records of implementing laws and policies to promote gender equality. Hare, 2003. In recent years, post-colonial theory has engaged with the double dilemma of nationalist feminists. They are, on the one hand, confronting the racist imperialist bias in Western feminism. On the other hand, the dominant nationalist ideology marks feminism itself as Western and illegitimate. This has led some feminists to articulate a specific position within feminism to address questions of colonialism and nationalism. Termed variously used as post-colonial feminism or third world feminism, this body of theory seeks to explore the unique experiences of women in the post-colonial countries of the so-called third world. There is a great deal of debate over the definition of third world itself, and Kumkum Sangari famously argues that the term does not only designate specific geographical areas, but also imaginary spaces. The key significance of the term, she wrote, lay in its ability to unite vast and vastly differentiated areas of the world into a single definition of underdevelopment. Sangari, 1999. Third world feminism is most closely associated with the writings of Chandra Mohanty, who coined the term to challenge the preoccupations of dominant Western feminism with issues internal to their own countries. She argues that terms such as women of color or third world women have been appropriated by Western feminists and produced as monolithic categories. This, in her view, results in a discursive colonization through the production of third world difference. The use of the categories of third world woman and third world difference in Western feminism often ties into larger, latent cultural and economic colonialism, given the hegemony of the West in the production and dissemination of humanities and scientific discourses. Mohanty wishes to use third world feminism to signal a viable oppositional alliance in a common context of struggle, rather than for color or racial identifications. In this sense, the term adds a new dimension to feminist thinking. Earlier attempts at internationalization of feminism were on the basis of linking nationally located struggles. Third world feminism seeks to place the imbalance of global politics at the heart of feminist debates, thereby linking in new ways issues of race, class and gender. Mohanty, 1991. Moreover, given the vast scope of such a feminist imagination, third world feminism is crucially engaged with questions of difference. Tring Mingha, for instance, argues that difference in this context is not division but an enriching and productive play of intersecting discourses. Tring, 1987. Third world feminism is thus in conversation with black feminism and womanism, discussed in the earlier section, African feminism, motherism, negofeminism, Chikna feminism and femalism. Let us now turn from the issue of race to a related distinguishable, as well as strongly challenged concept, that of tribe, especially in the context of Adivasi women in India. 8.7 Gender and ethnicity, Adivasi women in India. As we mentioned earlier, that a mythic construction of the Aryan race has played a significant role in the way the origin and development of Indian social hierarchy is explained. As we noted that such explanations lack historical validity in our current state of knowledge. In this, nevertheless dominant, trope of social categorization, the British inserted the term tribe. Early European ethnographers and anthropologists used this term synonymously with Aborigines, denoting three chief characteristics: animism as the chief religion, contrasted primarily with Hinduism, and Islam, primitive or backward in terms of social, economic and political organization, which resonated with the racial connotation of aboriginals, and autochthonous, by which they meant isolated from the neighboring civilizations, locked into simple economies of hills and forests. A dual and oppositional characterization of tribal people became staple in colonial literature, a tension between the noble savage image and that of the primitive backward. In recent years, the use of the term tribe has been strongly challenged for its evolutionist bias and its historical inaccuracy, given long traditions of settled agriculture and migration among so-called tribal peoples. The Indian constitution retained the term tribe to give rise to the category of scheduled tribes, who are entitled to special privileges, such as retaining their customary law and reservations in education, employment and political institutions. The alternative term, Adivasi, meaning literally original inhabitants or indigenous peoples, has emerged from within people's movements. Even though some scholars argue that the term Adivasi suffers from similar occlusions as the term tribe, it has gained wide currency now and has the legitimacy of self-description associated with various movements. The status of women among the Adivasis has been controversial and remains so even today. There has been, on the one hand, an emphasis on the egalitarian character of Adivasi communities in which women have high rates of economic and political participation and high status. On the other hand, there are accounts of denial of property rights, exclusion from decision-making, high incidence of witch killings and generally unequal gender relations in many Adivasi communities. There has been enough research, though a great deal more needs to be done, to show that all these are correct. The problem lies in the inference drawn from such disparate data. First, the enormous diversity of the population, ranging from the forest peoples such as Dangs and Bhils of Western India to the tribal majority areas of the northeast, cannot be homogenized in any one trope of gender. Among some of the groups in the northeast, matrilineal practices constitute far more positive regimes of gender than among some of the central Indian groups, who place a taboo on women touching the plough. In some communities, women enjoy considerable sexual and economic freedom, playing visible roles in production and marketing. In others, they play secondary roles. Second, Virginia XAXA points out the issue of women's property rights must be explored in the context of customary laws prevalent in the communities. Given that among many Adivasi groups, land is held by the community or the lineage rather than by individuals, the question of women's separate rights cannot be posed. In fact, some of the objections raised to women marrying out of the community are based on the disruption caused by the entry of outsiders in existing property arrangements. However, men kinsfolk are also able to use their power within the community to deprive women of their customary rights to maintenance. The identification of widows enjoying life interests in their husband's land as witches clearly displays the vested interests of the male agnates of the deceased husband.
Though, of course, as noted by Virginia XAXA, witch killing cannot be reduced to property relations alone. XAXA, 2007. The question of women's status within Adivasi communities is often linked to civilizational transformations, a premise drawn once again on a primary assumption of initial backwardness. Two primary strands of change have been highlighted in existing literature: Sanskritization or the absorption into caste Hindu society, the transition from tribe to caste; Christianization, a process that began with missionary activities in the colonial period. Both these processes are associated with restrictions being placed on the freedoms previously enjoyed by women. In the former case, women were drawn into mainstream notions of respectability, status involving their withdrawal from work, restrictions on divorce and remarriage, and the transition from bride price to dowry. The latter is associated with new freedoms such as access to education, right to worship, participation in social organizations around the church, and even entry into the clergy among some denominations. But Christian morals and values have also meant gender segregation and restrictions on divorce. Thus, there is no one answer to the question whether women gain or lose by such transition. The Adivasis have been involved in migrations from earliest historical memory, but in the colonial period, there was a huge increase in the scale. They were drawn into labor regimes in mines and plantations under highly exploitative conditions. In many of these cases, the need for cheap and docile female labor for production as well as reproduction drove employers to concentrate on recruitment among Adivasis. The resettlement of motley groups of Adivasis from eastern and central India in the tea plantations of Assam and North Bengal have left a troubled legacy of gathering significance now that the tea industry is facing a global crisis. The People of India Project, 1985, by the Anthropological Survey of India has identified 461 Adivasi communities, of which 174 have been identified as subgroups. According to the census, 2001, the Adivasi population is 84 million, which constitutes about 8.4% of the country's total population. The sex ratio is somewhat more even at 106.4 male to female at birth than the national average at 116.4. State policies after independence have also had skewed gender impact. The provisions for reservations in education and employment have benefited the men more than women. Female literacy rates in 1991, for instance, stood at 18.2% as against 29.6% for men. In terms of health, women suffer more from chronic malnutrition than men. In employment too, men have far outstripped women, despite the long tradition of female workforce participation in many of these communities. In the heartland of Adivasi settlements in central India, a battle wages today over natural resources. On the one hand, there are the rich mineral deposits which mining interests are keen to exploit. On the other, there is the Adivasi resistance to displacement. and the destruction of their way of life. In one estimate, about 67 million Adivasis have been affected by displacement termed recently as genocide. The crucial natural resources such as land, forests and water are being depleted in Adivasi communities. Access is being restricted. These changes have immense impact on the women, who have to adjust to the changing nature of work and livelihood. In the current political conjuncture, it may be useful to remember the atrocities to which Adivasi women have been subjected as a matter of routine. The scale and frequency of physical and sexual assault is mind-numbing and is perpetrated by agents of the state such as forest officials and other law-enforcing authorities, as well as by estate managers, private security guards and local traders and money lenders. The extreme vulnerability of Adivasi women has contributed to their increasingly active participation in armed resistance movements such as the Maoist ones. The Adivasi women, at the intersection of community and gender, face, in common with the black and nationalist feminists, a double dilemma. On the one hand, as individuals and citizens, they are entitled to basic human rights as well as other rights, such as those of property, freedom in marriage choice and others. On the other hand, however, the Indian Constitution also guarantees the Adivasi groups collective rights as minorities or as an oppressed and vulnerable community. The difficulty arises when the latter becomes an impediment to the former. Box number 8.8. Thus, the provision for customary law may be at odds with women's property rights. There are no clear or universal solutions to the oppositional demands of the politics of race, ethnicity and the politics of gender, but rather the need for a politics that can accommodate both. Thus, the search today is for a feminist praxis that does not pose these in oppositional terms as much as within a complex matrix of multiple axes of inequalities. 8.8 Let us sum up. As you have seen from the above discussion, the question of race has posed a potent challenge to feminist politics since the 19th century. In the United States, the abolition of the brutal plantation slavery system left the legacy of a large black population and their continued struggle for justice, equality and civil rights. At the interstices of a largely white feminist movement and a highly masculinized black liberation movement, the black woman was invisibilized. In response, the black feminist movement delineated a rich and complex theory regarding the intersections of race, class and gender, exploring the multiple disadvantages in the position of the black woman. We have also noted that the race question also emerged as a critical one in the context of colonialism. The ideology of the civilizing mission or the white man's burden configured the politics of race and gender in many colonized societies and became the framework within which nationalism was articulated. In many anti-colonial nationalist thinking, women became the bearers of tradition and national identity and in that capacity subjected to additional patriarchal control within their own societies. In the post-colonial context, some of these issues have been recast to challenge the dominance of white feminism in the West, emphasizing the imbalance in the global economy and politics to position women of the Third World within new parameters of social, economic, and cultural difference. This body of feminist thinking is referred to as post-colonial or Third World feminism. The category, race, is often used in an expansive sense to include ethnicity. Taking this broader view, this unit has also included a section of the situation of Adivasi women in India, exploring their complex position within their own communities as well as the larger developmental agenda of the state. This section has shown the various ways in which Adivasi women are subjected to atrocities within and from outside their communities. The double dilemma of these women, caught between the patriarchal forces within their own community and the wider assault on the community from the state and the market, is yet another reflection of the double axis of oppression faced by The various segments of women discussed in this unit, in each case variously historically shaped by experiences of racial inequality. Thank you.